Episode 38, A Match Made in Heaven. When Natalie saw this clause was missing, she said to Bryce, "Oh, one thing about this contract. There doesn't seem to be a clause about the husband and wife's intimate personal obligations to each other." Bryce looked at Natalie with distaste and said, "You don't have to worry. Not every woman is my cup of tea." And then he added Natalie's desired term to the contract right there and then. She was speechless. She felt that Bryce sometimes had a really vicious tongue. Having the additional term in the contract made Natalie feel much better. The relationship between the two of them was in title only. In private, she didn't want to have anything to do with this man. Everyone knew not to mess with Bryce. If their relationship became too complicated, she wouldn't know how to deal with the consequences. Placated, Natalie signed her name at the end of each copy of the contract. Bryce took the contracts and gave one to Natalie to keep without saying another word. Then Bryce took her to his home. For her part, she was surprised to find that he lived in such a big mansion. The mansion was one of the most prominent houses in the area, set in an exclusive estate with a private beach and a big park. It was like the family had their own little territory. Security was very strict. No uninvited guest had ever got in. When Natalie saw the location with her own eyes, she thought she was dreaming. She'd never thought that Bryce owned such an estate. She tried to calculate the size of the mansion. She thought that Bryce, as a single man, would be living in a one-bedroom apartment. But incredibly, it seemed that this entire place was his. She followed him into the mansion complex. She took Liam's hand and entered the house slowly. Liam himself was amazed by the mansion and the beach. The servants and butlers inside the mansion greeted Bryce respectfully. "Welcome home, sir." He nodded and gestured for Natalie to come up beside him. He introduced her to them. "This is my wife, Natalie, and this little boy is our son." When Bryce finished the introductions, Mrs. Perkins, the housekeeper, was shocked. She was speechless, staring blankly at Natalie and Liam. Mrs. Perkins had been with the Clare family for decades and had watched Bryce grow up from a very young age. Since when did he have such a big child? Mrs. Perkins, feeling very confused, stared at Liam. Looking closely at the little guy, she suddenly thought he looked a little similar to Bryce when he was a little boy. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she suddenly took Liam as Bryce's own. She was so excited that she became very emotional. Through her tears, she said, "You have finally gotten married. Now your parents can finally relax, Mr. Bryce." Seeing Mrs. Perkins so emotional, Natalie felt awkward standing there. She had not expected Bryce to introduce her and Liam in such a manner, as his wife and son. How was she supposed to explain the real circumstances of their arrangement now? While Natalie was lost in thought, Bryce told her, "If there's anything you need, anything at all, you can ask Mrs. Perkins. She understands everything and is very capable." Mrs. Perkins wiped away her tears and enthusiastically said to Natalie, "Yes, that's right, Mrs. Bryce. If there's anything you need, just let me know." Natalie quickly nodded and replied shyly, "Thank you." But in fact, she was thinking that this was only a contractual marriage with no real feelings, so she wouldn't bother Mrs. Perkins with requests. She didn't like to trouble other people, generally speaking. Mrs. Perkins read her thoughts. Seeing her act so politely, like a woman from a good family, she immediately took a liking to her. "Mr. Bryce's wife," she thought, "seems to be easy to get along with. The couple looks like a perfect match." With great enthusiasm, Mrs. Perkins took them upstairs to show them their room. Feeling embarrassed, Natalie followed Mrs. Perkins up the stairs to Bryce's room. The room was very spacious, done in the European style, but still very simple, with a chilly, austere atmosphere. Natalie couldn't help but sigh. His room really did match his character. While Natalie was looking around the room, Mrs. Perkins said, "This room is rather gloomy, don't you think? Now that you will be living here, do you think I should add something else here?" Natalie was startled. Did Mrs. Perkins think she was going to be staying in the same room as Bryce? Her thoughts were very confused. Just then, Bryce said, "She will be staying in the guest room for the time being. We'll have someone come in and remodel the master bedroom in a few days' time." Natalie felt relieved at that. It could be that he sensed her awkwardness, or maybe he was just saying it casually. Either way, she looked at him gratefully for suggesting this alternative. Mrs. Perkins thought Bryce was very attentive. She nodded in agreement, happy to see the pair of them getting on so well. Then she went downstairs to bring Liam back up with her. As they were walking, she asked him, "What's your name?" Liam looked up at the kind woman and felt a bond with her. He said, "My name is Liam." Seeing the little guy was so well-mannered and sensible, Mrs. Perkins liked him even more. She picked him up and carried him the rest of the way upstairs. She took him to look at the other rooms. Natalie and Bryce were alone. She didn't know what to say and looked at him helplessly. After a short while, he looked at the time. He stood up and said to her, "I have a meeting I need to attend." With those words, he turned and left, paying no attention to Natalie. She sighed. Bryce still had the same attitude as when she first met him, cold and emotionless. But in a way, this suited her, as it meant she could get along with him without any emotions getting tangled up. After Bryce left, she stood alone in the room, exploring its exquisite decoration and features. She suddenly felt overwhelmed. All of this felt very surreal, like a dream. How had she come to move in with this man so quickly? Bryce went straight to the company offices. His schedule was really busy, but he had made some exceptions because of Natalie.